So this lecture verse deals mostly with mood disorders. So we're going to be talking about major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder mostly. Dysthymia is another kind of subcategory of mood disorder. It is more of a low-grade depressive disorder, not like MDD, major depressive disorder. And your book talks a little bit more about it, but for lecture's sake, we're going to focus on numbers 1 and 3 here. So let's start off with major depressive disorder. The signs of depression need to last 2 weeks or more and can't be caused by drugs or medical conditions, right? Because sometimes drugs can cause depression. Certain drugs, a side effect is depression. And certain medical conditions can depress us, right? If you have cancer, it makes sense that you would be depressed. That's the origin, that's the cause. If someone in your family has died, that's depression. So we can have depression and be depressed because certain circumstances necessitate or equate to it. But major depressive disorder is labeled as such because of its length and its severity over a person's life course, not due to a specific event necessarily. And it's often been called the common cold of psychological disorders because it's become so common. So 5.8% of men, 9.5% of women, so almost double in women, report depression worldwide. Whereas if we go back to dysthymia, the low-grade depression, that's about 1.5% of the U.S. So it's pretty pervasive, pretty prevalent in society. And as we move forward, we're going to be talking about bipolar disorder. The interesting thing about bipolar disorder is that it's got the MDD, all the depression symptoms, which we're going to talk about, but it's also got a whole nother side to it, the manic side. So depression, usually involves someone feeling gloomy, down, withdrawn, maybe unable to make decisions. A lot of times it's inability to just do anything, or it's just not feeling anything, slowness of thought, not having the motivation to do the things you normally like to do, just feeling listless, maybe tired and just down. That's the depression, and that's really what categorizes MDD. Bipolar disorder has that phase, but it also has a phase where the person's oscillating between depression and mania, and the manic symptoms are the opposite. It's feelings of elation, euphoria even, being very active, getting a ton done, wanting to go here and go there and do this and do that, like constant activity, very hyperactive, multiple ideas, just like a brainstorm of constant thought activity. We used to call bipolar disorder manic depressive because of the mania and the depression. Now it's more clinically referred to as bipolar disorder. But so the person's alternating between these phases of depression and mania. And for each person, the phases are different. A person could spend 6 months in depression, 2 weeks in mania, and go back to depression. They could spend a month in depression, a month in mania, and keep going back for it. It just totally depends. It's very individual how long each of these phases last. Most bipolar individuals like the manic side. They get a lot done. They feel alive. They feel invigorated. But it can lead to some serious consequences because they may do and say things that they would never do. Think about when you're drunk. The things you say and you do that you're kind of unfiltered. And that's sort of how someone is with mania. They're spending money like crazy, making brash decisions, maybe being very flirtatious and maybe promiscuous, just, going out with whoever, doing whatever. being unfiltered, not having that sort of desire to hold back. So it can be very damaging for the person's reputation, job, family, etc. There's some videos I posted in this week's links that you're going to want to look at, you're going to want to watch, that will show you what people struggle with when they're dealing with bipolar disorder. What does it look like for these individuals? What kinds of mood swings? It's called bipolar because we typically think of it as being kind of like two opposites, two very different moods with really no pattern. Those moods can come and go very unexpectedly. They can last for short periods or long periods. And so it's a very cyclical disorder, and it's only a matter of time before another episode hits. Some of the more severe symptoms of it could be loss of energy, changes in eating and sleeping, even thoughts of suicide, very common. So the biological perspective on bipolar disorder is that there's a huge genetic component. In fact, people have studied the Amish. The Amish people have identified aberrant genes in family members suffering from the disorder, and they all have very similar lifestyle because the Amish are so secluded. So they're interesting people to study, where we can indicate exactly what the influence of genes are and the environment on such a mood disorder. And they're particularly vulnerable to bipolar disorder. So we've done what's called linkage analysis and association studies to start looking at and mapping possible genes that could be dispositions for depression. So we know that it's very highly genetic and tends to run in families. Social cognitive perspective is again very sociocultural in influence, and this is thought to contribute a lot to mental illness. Again, if we think about the cognitions, there's very self-defeating beliefs, negative explanatory styles. A person's sense of learned helplessness is big here, and that plays a huge role. There's a Hawk reading in your book by Seligman, which talks about learned helplessness. And so if you're interested, you could read that. I didn't assign it. I'm not sure what the number of the reading is, but it's Seligman's theory of learned helplessness. And it really relates to the depression side of this and the cycle of depression. Person having a very pessimistic explanatory style instead of optimistic. And that plays a big role in becoming depressed when life hands you lemons, right? Not being able to kind of work through it. Cognitive psychotherapy works really well because it's reversing and changing the thought patterns that often come with depression. So when you fail a test, instead of thinking, I'm going to fail out of college, I'm such a loser, changing it to where the person thinks, okay, it's one exam, it's not going to make or break my future, my prospects are still good, I will get through this. It's being able to think in that way, and that's sort of like conditioning a person to be able to do that, because these individuals are not used to thinking that way with that kind of a mindset. Treatment for mood disorders is usually a combination of drugs and therapy is usually the best. Rational emotive behavior therapy is popular. This is where there's the person is challenged in their irrational beliefs. They're given homework via behavioral techniques to modify their behavior, change their thought process, really forces clients to face their irrational thoughts and break the cycle. Learning that, I know it's natural for you to respond this way, but you have to fight that back and choose to respond in a different way. And so it's sort of helping them to do that. And so the person might also be seeing a therapist and working through some of these things, but also taking anti-maniac drugs, maniac, anti-manic drugs like lithium is popular for bipolar disorder, and then antidepressants for, or SSRIs for major depressive disorder. So that's very common because that helps them get a handle right away on what's happening biologically, and then also being able to work on the elements that they can control, like the thoughts or the behavior patterns. Okay, we're going to spend the rest of this time on schizophrenia, try to get through it in this lecture burst. The literal translation of schizophrenia is split mind, and it really refers to the person's split from reality, not knowing what's real and what's not. And it's a very severe disorder. 1.1% of the US population is thought to have schizophrenia, categorized by disorganized and delusional thinking, disturbed perceptions, off perceptions, and inappropriate emotions and actions. Some subtypes of schizophrenia would be paranoid schizophrenic, catatonic, disorganized, undifferentiated, and residual. The positive symptoms we think of with schizophrenia are things that happen in excess or distortion of normal functions. So like hallucinations, seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't there, delusions, irrational thoughts like I'm God, I can walk on water, I can fly. These are delusions, and they could be, again, this is very biological, so it could be associated with an overactivity of dopamine. Dopamine's been the primary neurotransmitter indicated in schizophrenia. So a lot of times dopamine reducing drugs can give a person with schizophrenia a pretty good outlook on treatment. The negative symptoms are where there's a decrease in normal functions like poor attention, lack of affect, emotion, mood, the inability to filter out certain stimuli in the environment and focus attention where it needs to be. People can have very flat affect, like not responding at all emotionally. Problems producing speech, apathy, very apathetic, and withdrawing from other people. So these are just the different types, right? So people can have positive or negative symptoms. They can have both, but we see usually some specifics. I put some clips of disorganized schizophrenia, I think, into your weekly folder from the movie The Soloist, where we see Jamie Foxx plays a man with disorganized schizophrenia. His very erratic speech patterns, very erratic thoughts, hallucinates, thinks weird things, hears weird things. So you can take a look at those to kind of get an idea of what that's like with that subtype of schizophrenia. There's also paranoid schizophrenia. I put a clip of The Beautiful Mind for you guys to see. This is paranoid schizophrenia because it's categorized by paranoia, thinking someone's out to get you, thinking you're on the run from someone or someone's after you. And that's kind of the primary delusion you have, which then leads to various hallucinations revolving around that. The onset and development of schizophrenia, it really is interesting cross-culturally, that it's largely, but not totally, a biological or genetic disease. This is one mental illness that is not thought to be environmental or caused by environmental stimuli, although usually there's an environmental event, a stressful event that triggers the onset of symptoms. And those symptoms usually occur in a person's early 20s, is where the onset happens. 7 to 8 out of 1,000 suffer from schizophrenia. And so it strikes people usually when they're maturing into adulthood. And there's usually a life event that triggers it, like some change in routine or life situation or circumstances that would lead to this. Okay, we're going to stop there for this lecture burst, and we will pick up with schizophrenia in the next one.